break this week, but please enjoy this special rebroadcast. This is The Zero Hour with Richard R.J. Askow, produced by the We Act Radio Network and broadcasting from the banks of the Anacostia directly into the halls of power. And now your host, Richard R.J. Askow.
Want to feel old? It's only a little more than 2 months since the Nashville Christmas bombing. It seems like forever, but it's only been a couple months. And I have to say, I'm still thinking about it. Here's why. Because although people have said he was a terrorist, the guy, Anthony Warner, who conducted that bombing, normally, I've been writing probably for 15 years about the hypocrisy of calling white people who conduct violence something other than terrorists, while calling brown people who conduct any form of political violence terrorists. But so I won't stop hammering on that hypocrisy. But in this case, I don't think he was a terrorist, because he went to enormous effort. And by the way, I think he used an enormous imagination to make sure that nobody was harmed except himself when his bomb went off. He was really trying to do something else, I think, which is sabotage a technology that he believed insanely was controlling people's minds. So the two things that continue to fascinate me about the Nashville bombing are the extent to which he made a serious and sophisticated effort to prevent the loss of life with the simulated gunshots, with the recorded woman's voice saying, "Do not approach the vehicle," danger and all that, with, of all things, playing Downtown by Petula Clark. But he did, he really worked hard to avoid loss of life. But now we learn, unsurprisingly, that he believed we were being overrun by lizard people and the most insane conspiracy theories. So on the one hand, he was a guy capable of taking great effort to protect human life, but on another, he had become absolutely insane in a way that sadly and terrifyingly millions of other people have as well.
Hello, this is Yo-Yo Ma, and you're listening to The Zero Hour with R.J. Askow.
And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard R.J. Askow. Joining us once again, I always learn from our conversations, I always look forward to them, is economist Richard Wolff. You know Richard Wolff's work from his books. The latest is The Sickness is the System, about the pandemic. You know him from democracyatwork.info. His program, Economic Update, is available in audio form and is also on Free Speech TV on Tuesday evenings. And he joins us once again. So first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Richard. I'm glad to be here.
Always good to have you. And what I was especially looking forward to speaking with you about is this new wave of commentary I'm beginning to see about, sort of, I would call it post-pandemic optimism. For example, I see in the Washington Post a headline, it's given two headlines: why the U.S. economy could be poised for unfamiliar growth is one, and another is U.S. economy may have its best chance in years to break from era of subpar growth. There was a similar headline in the New York Times. It read, on the post-pandemic horizon, could that be ... a boom, subheading, signs of economic life are picking up and mounds of cash are waiting to be spent as the virus loosens its grip. The analogy one or two of these articles is made is to the post-World War II economic boom. I think you've been pretty clear in your concerns about the long-term systemic damage that is both reflected by what we're seeing during this pandemic and we will endure as a result of it. I've been fairly pessimistic. Were we wrong? Is there a good chance that we're going to see, a lift of the kind we haven't seen in decades?
Well, I think you and I share a notion that predicting the future is something nobody with a right mind should do. I'm reminded of the story that if you go to a carnival and there's someone who will read the future for you, looking at tea leaves or at the lines in your palm, and they tell you who you're going to be with 2 weeks from now, the purpose of that is for you to have a nice giggle about this. If you start agonizing because you don't want to do that thing in 2 weeks that they told you would happen, then you've misunderstood an entertainment for actually having the capacity to do something. So I'm not going to predict anything. And I would urge anyone watching that if you encounter a person who gives you confident notion about what's going to happen, my advice is talk to somebody else. Anyway, having said all of that, 2 comments. First, there is no way that I could imagine, which doesn't mean it can't happen, but there's no way that I can imagine anything comparable to what happened at the end of World War II. Let's just review to get an idea. Prior to the ending of World War II, which let's call 1945, what you had was 16 years of war preceded by 11 years of major depression. People had been unable to consume in the ways that they had been aware of before for 16 years. They had postponed, they had avoided, they had gone through a depression, they had been terribly poor in terms of losing out on basics of food, clothing, shelter. They had accumulated really enormous desires, needs, repairs that had to be done, problems of life that had finally to be attended to. So when the war was over and when the depression didn't come back at the end of the war, as many had feared it might, then there was the basis for a kind of euphoria to take over, to make up, to finally paint the house that hadn't gotten a coat of paint for 20 or 30 years, to buy a car if you could afford it, et cetera, number one. Number two, the United States was the only economy that came out of World War II not destroyed. All of the competitors of the United States, Britain, Europe, Japan, Russia, whoever could have mounted some sort of campaign of competition economically, was incapable of doing so. They had their hands full trying to recover from the war. It put the United States in an absolutely unsustainable situation in which the world could be reorganized to serve the United States, which was the only economy that had no war on its territory other than the Pearl Harbor attack at the very beginning. Other than that, it had grown its economy because it had provided materiel support for its allies in Europe. It had put people back to work. It hadn't had its industry destroyed by war. And so those 2 conditions, the world as your oyster, as your export market, as your source of profitable investment, cheap, very cheap inputs on the one hand, and the accumulated deferred consumption, the deferred recapitalization of your industry, these were unbelievably exceptional circumstances. You couldn't make them, they didn't really last much more than 25, 30 years after World War II, then they were exhausted. Nothing comparable is here now. We've had 1 year of a bad economic crash although not quite as bad as the Great Depression, and the COVID, and that's a serious issue. And there may be a bounce, a boom coming out of it, if you like, because of deferred consumption and because of the massive amount of money creation that the Federal Reserve has poured into the economy. But you will not see what we saw after 1945. And here are 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, the United States is worse affected by the COVID than most of its competitors. Not better off, worse off. We have had our 500,000 people die. We've had tens of millions of people get sick. We've had real serious consequences of those catastrophes that will take time to play out. I've read recently about how banks have been affected by the collapse of the people who owe them money, the restaurants that cannot pay the mortgages they took out, the buildings with those restaurants that cannot collect as from the restaurants as tenants, therefore they cannot pay back their bank loans. So banks have been cutting back on credit, have been demanding higher interest, more constraints on the borrower. That will play itself out over years to come in all kinds of ways, whereas some of our competitors, and here I'm thinking primarily of the People's Republic of China, have come through the crisis and the COVID much, much, much better, much less destroyed. There's a story last week that you might enjoy, RJ, in which it was pointed out that more people attended movie theaters in China last year than in the United States. Hollywood has become dependent on the Chinese market. When they calculate what films they can afford to produce, they are also taking into account how much of that film will be shown in theaters in China, and therefore bringing in revenue, which is crucial to whether the film will be made, et cetera, et cetera. So we're talking about a situation in which the competition for the United States will, if anything, be sharper in the years ahead, not a kind of summertime of exceptionalism that you had after 1945. And then we have the ongoing tariff wars, which Mr. Biden seems to be willing to somehow continue in some fantasy of hard-on China mentality. That will mean high tariffs that American importers have to pay. That will hamper trade this year as it did last year, even though the Chinese managed to work around it. It's not good for the American economy. It wasn't last year. Mr. Trump's promise that trade wars are easy to win was glib. This trade war, the United States lost and the Chinese won, and the Chinese didn't even want it. The ironies here should be lost on no one. And now the most important, I've left to last. The long-term problems of the United States economy, they haven't gone away and they haven't been solved. We have greater inequality now than we did a year ago. We have larger numbers of people that are food insecure, the euphemism for hungry that we now use, than we've had before. The bitterness and divisiveness of the United States seems to be getting worse, not better. I could go on. Our racial difficulties are far from resolved. Our gender conflicts are far from resolved. We've just barely gotten over an assault on the capital of the United States. The idea that we are in anything like the post-World War II situation strikes me as boosterism on steroids. I mean, wow. Can we have a bump? Can there be something like this? Sure, there can be. But I would caution people, the last 2 days of the stock market in this country have been major downturns. The people whose job it is to invest huge amounts of money based on what they see coming, they are very ambivalent. and rightly so.
Which gets me to, Richard Wolff, the whole question. I mean, there are two tracks with which I think I wrestle with this question and your answer with it. One of which is, I'll defer for later, I think, which is the sort of ideological utility of predicting a boom, when right. As you say, prediction is an uncertain business. But the other is the definition of a boom itself. Right. Because it seems to me that when these articles talk about a boom in consumer spending, well, for whom? Which consumers? Is it driven by savings? Is it driven by, I mean, we're still seeing high unemployment. We're not seeing any big spike in salaries that I'm aware of, wages that I'm aware of. So there may be some pent up demand, but even if there were such a boom, would it be a stock market boom? Would it be, what kind of boom or lift would we even be talking about? And would the measurements used adequately reflect the daily lives of the majority?
Well, you know, if it were, it's a big if, but if it were the case that some kind of bounce happened, that people who have saved money, and the savings rate in the country is up a bit, people who have saved money will now spend it. And by the way, that will be determined not just by the immediate post-war, immediate post-COVID boom that they're talking about. It'll be determined by what people think is going to happen. For example, if you think that the COVID is over, you may be more willing to spend your savings than if you're worried that new strains or this or that will make this a lingering problem. And let's remember, Biden told us we're going to have our problem solved by Christmas. Some of the gung-ho types are talking about herd immunity in April. And Dr. Fauci says we're going to be wearing masks in 2022. So, I mean, even among the people whose job it is to figure this sort of stuff out, the level of uncertainty and ambivalence means that anyone who might consider an expenditure is also going to be wondering whether it's safe to do that next month or in this summer or in the autumn, because of all of these things that will make also their importance felt in this situation. But I want to stress too that the American people are deeply anxious about their conditions. If there is an increase in consumption, you're right if you're suggesting it'll be wealthy people. But you know, more and more, I've noticed in the last decade that what is happening to wealthy people is what is reported in the newspaper, is what is pointed to by politicians who need to look good. If they're an incumbent, they want to look as though they've been doing well. You know, look at how Trump kept talking about the stock market because there was nothing else he could talk about. Everything else was going down into the toilet. The stock market was boosted by the Federal Reserve's money creation, which poured into the stock market and not into the broader economy. So he pointed to that. And my suspicion is, even if we have a bounce, it'll be the wealthy people who do the bouncing, and they will be excited about the bouncing, and they will talk about it as a wonderful sign. And only if that persuades the mass of people to overlook the level of debt they're carrying, the level of insecurity of their jobs, even if they have one. I mean, let's remember, we're a society that is having trouble raising the minimum wage above $7.25 an hour, which is among the very lowest of the entire world. I mean, we are a society that is not prepared to give the people the mass support without which a boom isn't going to happen. So for me, I am deeply skeptical. But people are wrong. I could be wrong too. And making a solid prediction, I don't believe in.
And we'll be right back after this with more of our conversation with economist Richard Wolff. I am Richard R.J. Eskow, and you're listening to The Zero Hour.
You are listening to the We Act Radio Network, produced in Washington, D.C. Visit us online at weactradio.com or at youtube.com/weactradiodc.
And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard R.J. Eskow, and we now continue our conversation with economist Richard Wolff. And I meant to do a little research on this before we spoke, Richard Wolff, and I neglected to, but it strikes me that a lot of the potential spending that's being discussed here that would be might be categorized as a potential boom, were it to happen, would be, when they're talking about cars, they're talking about household appliances, home improvements. A lot of these things are fueled by debt. I meant to look up what current, personal levels of personal debt are now, consumer debt versus previous eras. But it strikes me that even if we were to have that kind of a boom, it would be precarious and potentially burdensome for working people.
Well, it's worse than that. I mean, I don't mean to cast a shadow or a cloud, but let's look at a potential boom. More than ever in American history, if there were some kind of surge in consumer purchases, I would like to make 2 points. Number one, a huge part of that money will leave the United States and go to China, because that's where these goods come from. Right. And by the way, the Chinese are in the process of building automobiles that Americans are going to want to buy. They already produce a vast array of goods. And if they're not produced in China, they're produced in other low-wage countries. So now understand what I'm saying this way. If there's a surge, it's going to be much less ramifying in our economy, because so much of that spending will leak into other economies, creating booms and growth over there, not over here, because of the whole nature. And that brings me to the second point. Mr. Biden made a big splash yesterday, and the Republicans cheered him on about, I am going to investigate our supply chains. The way the United States, whether it's for computer chips or anything else, has become dependent as a society on long chains of raw materials and partially finished goods that are made in various parts of the world. And the implication is, I'm not going to let us be so dependent. Well, here's a little lesson in economics. The reason we have long global supply chains is because profit-driven capitalist enterprises in the United States wanted that. That makes more profit for them. They want to get the inputs where they are cheapest. They want to get bits of production done where it is the cheapest to do. They want to store materials that need to be stored in places where it's cheapest to store. That's why we have them. It's not a governmental mistake or a policy issue. It's how capitalism has always worked. The problem is Americans don't understand that it's fun riding up the hill with capitalism. It's not so much fun when capitalism moves on. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio. That's a place from which capitalism has left, has gone, has abandoned. And that's the future of what is going on a global scale now. That problem isn't going to be solved if Mr. Biden were successful. If he did stop American companies from their global supply chains and they produced it all here, it would cost them much, much more to produce those goods, which would nullify whatever this boom was able to get going with more spending, because the more spending wouldn't create more goods and services. It would be lost in paying the higher prices if you were going to actually do something as opposed to mere rhetoric about these supply chains.
By the way, I'm struck by the fact that you come from Youngstown, Ohio. I come from Utica, New York, and
same story.
Absolutely. And if a foreign country had wreaked the kind of devastation on American cities that global capitalism has wreaked wreaked on cities like Youngstown and Utica, we'd be in a world war. So, I just make that statement almost parenthetically, but I wonder sometimes when people write these articles raising the possibility of a post-COVID boom, and to be fair, they include all the appropriate disclaimers. It might not happen. There's much we don't know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it strikes me that articles like this, especially in this moment, have a clear political utility. I don't know how conscious it is for the newspaper editors and reporters who write them, but it seems to me it's very convenient in this moment when Congress is being challenged, at least by some, to meet the gravity of the moment, which there's no indication it's about to do. But when the federal government is being challenged to meet the gravity of the moment, that suddenly articles are coming out saying, hey, it's going to be great when this is all over. You think I'm being too cynical?
Not at all. It's very well understood, both in political and business circles, that it's called on Wall Street, talking your book. And what it means is you're hyping the particular company or the industry or the entire economy or the market to benefit yourself. And you want to hear cynicism? Let me offer you the following. Makes yours look a little bit calmer than mine. The stock market has been going down. It's going down massively today, or at least it was. And my sense is here's what we may be at, what is called a peak, a top, because the professionals are pulling out and they don't want to spook because they are all pulling out, but they still have some in. So this is a good moment to bring in the naive retail investor, the man or woman sitting on the sidelines, having a little money in the bank that they're not getting much interest on, that they've been upset about, and saying, well, look, this is a great time to go in there and buy some shares of stock that you work at, or that's in your community, or that you've studied about, or you've learned about, or your Uncle Harry has talked to you about, because, it's looking really good. Fleecing these poor folks who do that as a professional so that you can sell huge blocks of stock at a bit of a higher price because of these strange people who don't understand what's going on and are swayed by, dare I say it, an article in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post. That has happened before. I'm not saying it's happening now. I don't know enough to be sure of it, right. But it is something that has happened before. And retail investors, you should be very, very cautious. If the Robin Hood GameStop adventure didn't teach that to you, this one should.
And not just retail investors, right? I mean, I would argue you will recall Goldman Sachs being bailed out and rewarded for, among other things, something called abacus, in which it was selling stocks to institutional investors, pension funds and the like, if I recall correctly, while at the same time managing that through the figure that was best known for shorting some of the same financial instruments.
Absolutely.
So the model of selling people something that you're privately don't think is going to work, that is, in a way, Wall Street's business model, right? So isn't it?
Right. I mean, if you understand what shorting means, and it's very easy to explain, it is dealt with as if it were some mystical. It isn't. You borrow a share of stock. That's all. You borrow it, and then you immediately sell it, which you are allowed to do. You are promised to pay it back, to give it back to the person you borrowed it from, let's say 3 months from now. So what you're doing is a simple game. You borrow the share, let's say it's worth $100, and you sell it immediately. So now you have $100. And you hope that between now and 3 months from now, when you plan to go back into the market and buy the shares to give back to the person you borrowed them from, you're just hoping that you can do that for less than $100, because then you keep the difference. Okay, but the problem is, which they don't want to tell you, you now have a vested interest in driving that stock down. and you can talk to your friendly reporter, you can talk to your friendly TV anchor, you can do all kinds of things that you are or are not legally entitled to do. But whatever happens, if the price of that stock goes down, you make money, which means that the stock market is a place that is very dangerous for you to enter if you're not on top of all of that kind of maneuvering and calculating, which the average person hasn't the time or the training to do. And so you're going into a casino, but at least in a casino, you kind of know the rules. You know about the two green colors on the roulette wheel and what they mean, but you don't know these things in the stock market most of the time. They're not immediately obvious. It's not that it's all that complicated, but it's a system that has never been laid out in front of you, and the chances of your getting fleeced are very, very good.
That makes perfect sense. The other thing you know in a casino is never bet against the house.
Yeah.
But last topic, I guess, all this reading about, this equating to the end of World War II, which I don't think is an apt analogy anyway, and you made that point. There's not likely to be, an armistice day or, this thing is going to peter out or drag out or turn into something else. We don't know. But so there won't be that moment of unleashed demand, I don't think. But in any case, it got me thinking about possibilities for real political transformation, namely what we saw, let's say, in Great Britain at the end of World War II. Here was a country that had truly been decimated by the war, economically, physically, in many ways, in the ways you described that we had not been, had been guided through that war by a charismatic figure, but a conservative, Winston Churchill. And in 1945, at the close of that war, chose, I would argue, correct me if I'm wrong, but the most dramatic shift to the left that country's ever seen in the socialist government of Clement Attlee. That somehow, if I tried to steep myself in that moment in history, somehow they looked around at the war devastation and the poverty and the housing crises, food shortages, and they said, we need to move to the left to address this. Is there, in your view, is there any way that the pandemic can become a teaching crisis for the United States or teaching opportunity, the way that the war, that the British people, at least my understanding, looked at the war and said, we need to take and the unemployment that preceded it and said, we need to take a dramatic shift going forward. Is there any way that could happen here, you think?
Yeah, I think it could. I would add to your story of Britain, the story of France. The first post-war government in France, led by General de Gaulle, basically. I mean, the real leader was de Gaulle because of the resistance. There were 4 members of the French Communist Party in his cabinet of the first government. They had to, because the communists led the resistance against the Germans. They were heroes in their society, and they had the power of the devastation that France was pushing them, and the heroes who had beaten back the oppressor, de Gaulle on one hand, the military, and the Communist Party and the resistance on the other. Americans don't want to know these kinds of histories because it upsets their worldview, but it is the case. Could it happen here? Absolutely. And let me tell you where I would expect it from, may surprise you. Texas. Because what Texas has just gone through is something like this. Yes, it didn't last a long time, but they have just been traumatized. They have just been like a puppy who did something inappropriate on the rug. They've had their nose rubbed in the inappropriate thing that they did. The Wall Street Journal yesterday carries a story that the electric rates of the deregulated Texas electricity market made Texans pay $28 billion so far this century, more than was paid by those Texans and those in other states who have regulated electric utilities. I mean, what in the world more do you need? The people who not only ripped you off didn't take the steps necessary to be sure that electricity could flow when the weather got cold, and that therefore jeopardized your gas, your water. I mean, it's beyond words, the suffering, including death, that they have imposed out of a greed for profitability that is the kind of shock that can lead a population to recognize this isn't the fault of this or that. This is a systemic problem. The local commission in Texas, I mean, you can't make this up. It's called ERCOT, E-R-C-O-T. The R stands for reliability. The job of the commission was to assure that electricity was reliable. They didn't do that. And when 5 of them resigned yesterday, the word goes out that the commissioners in Texas were not residents of Texas. They were people brought in to do what they did, which is nothing in the way of what they were supposed to do. This kind of an event, coming on top of the fires in California, of the COVID disaster, of a country of 4% of the world's population suffering 20% of the world's dead and more than 25% of the world's cases. These are levels of systemic dysfunction that are the kind of event comparable, they're not the same, but comparable to going through a devastating war and wondering what in the world you got out of it, and being determined that some new and different direction is necessary.
And of course, to do that, Richard Wolff, we're going to need our own Clement Attlees and Anthony Wedgwood Benz and other visionary leaders. And I guess we'll just have to keep nurturing them to the best of our ability with the platforms we have. And
well, one of the most, as I watch, as you do, as we watch, not the least interesting thing is that the United States may become a pioneer in yet another way, that it discovers the need to go to the left, and that the people leading us there are women, overwhelmingly women, young women who are not so young, but young and not so young women who are the leaders, who are figuring it out as we go along. And that also will be a contribution that this country can make. And I, for one, am very, very heartened as I watch Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, the whole group of those people, Cori Bush. This is a remarkable change in American society, and it offers a kind of hope, maybe not yet of the scope of a Clement Attlee, but it is our version, because we have a long catch-up to the 75 years of Cold War that we are emerging from.
Well, it certainly is an exciting time to be alive.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
We're Richard Wolff, economist, host of Economic Update. His latest book is The Sickness is the System. As always, very enlightening to speak with you. And as always, thank you so much for coming on the program.
My appreciation too. Our conversations are wonderful. I wish somehow we could keep them and make them available, but I know you do that anyway on your site there. So my appreciation for your program as well, please.
Thank you so much. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard R.J. Eskow. The writer and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson is often known for his pithy quotes, repeated all over. Many of us learned them in school. Here's one we didn't learn in school. He said, sometimes a scream is better than a thesis. When did he say that? He said it when writing to a friend about the fact that he had written a letter to the President of the United States, Martin Van Buren, about the genocide against the Cherokee Nation. He had said that he had nothing imaginative to say about it, that he had no genius words about it, that he was sure that his words to the President of the United States would not change anything, but he felt morally bound to do it. He said there was nothing insightful about the letter. He wrote, the amount of it, to be sure, is merely a scream, but sometimes a scream is better than a thesis. Now, why would he say that? Because there are times in human history when the outrages all around us are so profound that if all we can do is scream, we need to scream in order to be people of conscience and in order perhaps to call other people to become people of conscience as well.